Welcome to Educate, Agitate, Organise Saturday. This is a joint endeavour between Don't Leave Organise and Socialist Telly, where we explore grassroots campaigns and organisers all around the UK. Really pleased to be joined this week as my co-host by Jane Aitchison, also from Don't Leave Organise. Jane, how you doing?
I'm fine, Matt. Thanks ever so much for having me on. I'm really looking forward to today's show because I've worked with Ellen Clifford for years and DPAC. When I was the president of DWP and PCS, I worked with them at the beginning of the Tory government in 2010, talking about how we could have a better benefit system for disabled people. But of course, the Tories just made it worse and worse and worse. And then when I stood as the parliamentary candidate for Labour in 2019, I was really, really proud that DPAC supported me. In fact, I was the first parliamentary candidate that DPAC supported. So brilliant that we've got them on. Can't wait for what Ellen's going to talk to us about today.
Fantastic. Should we go to the interview?
Absolutely.
Really pleased to be joined by Ellen Clifford, who is an activist with Disabled People Against the Cuts and also the author of The War on Disabled People, Capitalism, Welfare and the Making of a Human Catastrophe. Ellen, really great to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
So, Ellen, there's a ton of stuff I want us to talk about, but I think we need to start, obviously, of huge impact on disabled people in this country has been 10 years of ideologically driven austerity. But to understand that impact, I think we need to kind of understand what the context and the situation was like before that. So I wonder if you could talk us through that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, things were already bad enough for disabled people. I remember, I think it was 2008, Leonard Cheshire did some research that showed disabled people were twice as likely to live in poverty as non-disabled people. In that time, we were also looking at issues around unequal access to healthcare. MenCap did a lot of work looking at people with learning difficulties who died of very avoidable things while in hospital just because their access needs weren't understood and catered for within the system. There was also a lot of work done on disability hate crime, and a really seminal book by Catherine Quarmby came out looking at the particular phenomenon of disability hate crime murders, often where the individuals have been tortured before they've been killed. And this is kind of goes against what people think about disability, in that they assume, a lot of people, assume who would hurt a disabled person, a disadvantaged person. But actually there is a lot of hate and hostility in society. The Equality and Human Rights Commission did a report and did some research into the extent of bullying and harassment that disabled people face every day. So we kind of thought things were pretty grim already. And then along came the coalition government and 10 years of things getting dramatically worse.
And just in terms of the impact of that austerity, obviously Cameron said we were all in this together, but clearly the burden of those cuts, on that erosion of the welfare state, that was felt acutely by disabled people, wasn't it?
Yeah, disabled people were overwhelmingly disproportionately hit. Cuts were actually, we would say, targeted on disabled people. I think when Ian Duncan Smith famously resigned in 2016, having been the architect of the welfare state and having created these savage conditions within the benefit system, he resigned, apparently championing our rights, saying, it's gone too far. And on the Andrew Marr show, he basically said that, the Tories calculated that disabled people don't vote for them. So why not, hit us very hard? But it was also the result of, that you had the shake-up of the welfare system, which was being led by Ian Duncan Smith and Lord Freud, with their great vision based on all these myths of worklessness and their desire to force people into work. And then on the other hand, you had austerity driven very much by George Osborne, making these enormous cuts to local authority budgets. And what disabled people experienced was kind of the interface between the two. So you had, local authorities, most of their expenditure goes on the social care budget, which disabled people are obviously highly reliant on. And then at the same time, you have the shake-up of the welfare system, requiring people to reapply for all their benefits. But if your social care has been taken away, you don't have the support to reapply for your benefits. So we were being hit from all sides. And because disabled people are more reliant on public services, then every cut to public services impacted on us in a different way. And what the government consistently refused to do was a cumulative impact assessment, which would have shown the far from what they were saying about targeting resources at the most vulnerable, always protecting the most vulnerable, they kept saying. What they were doing was actually targeting the cuts at us. The more disabled you are, the worse you were hit. And that was the findings of, there was initially a piece of research done quite quickly in 2013 by the Centre for Welfare Reform, and that found that disabled people were on average hit 9 times harder than non-disabled people by the cuts. But if you were a disabled person with very high support needs and used social care, for example, you were being hit 19 times harder. And that picture was then subsequently reflected in a cumulative impact assessment that the Equality and Human Rights Commission did. After the government's consistent failure to do their own, they did one, and that showed similar, that the more disabled you were, the worse you were hit by the cuts.
And am I right in thinking there was condemnation from the UN as well?
Yeah, so one of the, through Disabled People Against Cuts, which was, set up out of a protest outside the Tory party conference in 2010, disabled people could see quite quickly what was coming for us and mobilised quite quickly. We used every single tool in the campaign box to try and stop as much as we could. And one thing Disabled People Against Cuts did, led in particular by Debbie Jolly, our co-founder, who's sadly no longer with us. She had the idea of trying to trigger a special investigation under the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Disabled People. And there's state parties who are signed up to that can also sign up to what's called the optional protocol. And that allows the relevant committee to investigate if you're seen to have breached anything. And Debbie had the idea of trying to trigger this process. And after a few years of sending such a volume and level of convincing evidence, the committee really had no choice for their own credibility but to trigger this unprecedented investigation. And the finding, it was very thorough. They came over for 2 weeks, the committee, interviewed hundreds of disabled people, families of victims who died through benefit cuts, but also journalists, public lawyers, all kinds of people involved, as well as the government. They read thousands of pages of documents, and their conclusion was that the that the UK government was guilty of grave and systematic violations of disabled people's rights. And that didn't mean, the government just dismissed that out of hand. And it didn't mean they were saying things were worse here than for disabled people, say, in developing countries, where they might have no benefits at all. What they were saying was they were so concerned that there was clearly a systematic and deliberate agenda to take back disabled people's living standards. And that's what worried them and why they made that finding. But of course, the government just dismissed it.
So that sounds like this goes beyond just doing something because they can get away with it. It's doing something in a very targeted and a deliberate way. What's the ideology that underpins that?
Well, I think, Cameron more or less said this, I think, at one of those big posh banquets, mayor's banquets or something, that this was about permanently realigning society. And I think so, it's there's much more awareness now than there was that this was, a political choice, not a necessity. But under the guise of austerity, they were carrying out this plan to permanently, as I say, realign society. To kind of really, really pare down, I think, the amount of support that people can get through the state. I think there was a very clear privatisation agenda as well. So Lord Freud, who'd previously actually been commissioned by New Labour to look at revamping the welfare state, he then crossed the floor to the Tories so he could carry on his work that he was so committed to, because he had so much experience being a banker. Of course, he knew all about welfare reform, and he had these ideas about privatising vast swathes of the social security system. He actually, it's quite interesting looking back now, he had this vision that there would be this flourishing market within that sector. And actually what we've seen subsequently with the outsourced assessments for, employment support allowance for the disability benefits, is that market has never actually materialised. Part of that, I think, I'd like to think is down to kind of campaigners, and because we gave those private companies who are profiting off disabled people's misery such a hard time that actually a lot of companies, don't want to get involved. So kind of what their vision never actually materialized, but it was definitely, this agenda to put more public money into the hands of profiteers. I think also the kind of the economics and the idea of using austerity to make sure that profits were maximized at a time of low productivity. I see that as kind of a lot behind George Osborne's, behind his cuts agenda, which of course, again, it didn't work what he was trying to achieve. But all of that, combined and hit disabled people.
I think that there's some darker stuff going on. That's dark enough, but you've also got, look, our current Prime Minister has publicly stated some awful self-conscious analogy about cornflakes, and how if you shake a box of cornflakes, which is a very twee way of dressing up essentially your eugenics agenda.
Yeah. Yes, disabled people are seen as having less worth in society, and there is that relationship between disability and capitalism, whereby disability really it's a category that didn't really actually exist before the Industrial Revolution. You had people with different illnesses or impairments, but they weren't they weren't part of a category as a whole. I'm not saying that things were great for people with impairments, like in feudal society, for example, but it was different. People were treated differently. People might have, different roles. Say if working on the land with your family, there were different roles for people as per what you could and couldn't do. But I think through the last couple of centuries, there was a need, I think, to remove people who were felt to get in the way of the productivity of the working class, and people with impairments were then seen as something that you wanted to remove. And there was, of course, that the eugenics movement really took hold across the whole of the Western world from the 19th century onwards, and there were very clear ideas about stopping people who were seen as defective from breeding, and those ideas are still with us today in part. And they lost a lot of favour, obviously, through the Nazis and what happened. Under the Third Reich, there was the Action T4 program, where they were killing disabled adults and children en masse. And of course, I'm not sure a lot of people realise, but no one was ever successfully prosecuted for that, because it was felt that they were German citizens, so the Germans could do what they wanted to their own disabled people, but also because the defence was used that what was happening in other countries like the US and Britain wasn't that different, because compulsory sterilisation, etc. So although eugenics did fall from favour through that very extreme and brutal example, some of those ideas have always been kind of around and underpinning society's view of disabled people. There's also the fact that the welfare state, of course, was deliberately set up to exclude us. Beveridge himself was a member of the Eugenics Society, and he believed you needed the whip of starvation to make people work. And he was worried that if you gave benefits to people who are disabled and who can't work, that would take away the work incentive and encourage malingering. So there's never been a time, I think, where those ideas haven't fully gone away. And certainly when Boris Johnson was elected, it was very scary for disabled people, knowing the things he said in the past, and that he has, more clearly formulated eugenicist views, I would say.
And so given that given that the huge challenges that we face sort of going into or coming out of the COVID crisis, if and when we come out of the COVID crisis, the ongoing and developing economic crisis and all the rest of it, the looming climate crisis, I mean, we've got to be really careful, or some of these really dangerous, horrific ideas could really kind of find quite fertile soil. So as the left, it's really it's our responsibility to understand and articulate the counter narrative to that. I mean, what should the left be doing? What is the left doing? There's a bit of a loaded question there.
Well, I do think that in Britain there's a much better understanding than there was of disability politics and disabled people's oppression, due, I would say, to the fact that not only DPAC but other disabled campaigners who've been fighting austerity and welfare reform, we consciously made ourselves part of that broader anti-austerity movement, and through kind of struggle alongside each other, I think it has changed people's views. But I think there's still quite a long way to go in that. I think a lot of people, if they don't have cause to question it, just take on the dominant ideas in society. And the dominant narrative is one of seeing disability as a matter of personal tragedy. You literally have films like, I don't know if you remember or saw this film, Me Before You. It was based on a book. But the message of that film is literally, it's better to be dead than disabled. You've got a character who's a millionaire. He can have anything he wants. And he acquires an impairment, falls in love with his beautiful nurse, Amelia Clark. So he has love and money and everything. And yet he still is determined to kill himself. And that's how the film ends. So this is what people think. They think it's a tragedy. If you have a disabled child, or if you acquire an impairment, people do have this view that they'd rather not live. And that obviously has a knock-on in terms of how disabled people who are alive are treated. And you can, access and inclusion to be able to take part in political spaces is one thing. And I think there's a low level of awareness around that. But I think if you start to understand disability on a political level, then I think to a certain extent some of those things kind of fall into place. It becomes more natural to think, well, it's not the person's fault that they can't get in the room. It's because we haven't set it up the same. The social model of disability is a way of looking and understanding disability that was developed in Britain by socialists, disabled socialists in the 1970s, 1980s. And that way of looking at disability has been very influential around the whole world. And yet still, among other non-disabled socialists, there's a very low level of awareness of that. And I really do encourage people to kind of find out about the social model and to start to think of it as a political issue and as a socio-economic oppression. So under the social model, it's interesting because it sounds quite complicated to explain, but a disabled person often gets it immediately. People with learning difficulties, with cognitive impairments, they can get it because they feel it. So we draw a distinction between the impairments and illnesses or differences that we live with, such as physical mobility impairments, sensory impairments, could be learning difficulties or neurodiversity. So that's what we live with. And then on top of that, you have a whole layer of socioeconomic oppression. And that's what we mean when we refer to, when we talk about disability. That's what disabled people are referring to. So that's why in Britain, we don't say people with disabilities, because it doesn't make sense under the social model. We're disabled by society, and we live with impairments, and our experience of life is so different depending on what impairment or illness you've got. We can have completely contradictory access needs. So people with learning difficulties might struggle with technology, so need to be face to face to communicate, and then people with chronic illness need to connect remotely over the laptop while in bed. So our experiences are very different, but what unites us is that oppression. And so the social model is also fundamentally a tool for collectivizing and then going out and fighting society and changing it for the better. And it's really liberating when disabled people discover it, because you could quite often live with this internalized oppression that, I'm different from my family, I'm a burden, I don't fit in with society. You discover the social model, and it's like this light bulb moment you can see in people's faces. It's like, oh, they're the problem. Society's the problem. The government's doing this. That's affecting my life, which means I can't fit in. I'm okay. So, I think the social model is a wonderful thing, and would encourage people to kind of engage with that. But also, for me, what I think one of the things I love about disability, if you could say that, is just the way that disabled people, we have to exist in a very interdependent way, because there are things that we can't do, either due to limitations by our impairment or the barriers society puts in our way. So we're forced to recognise that we're not, that human beings aren't designed to be kind of individual. We hear that the ideology of individualism that really upholds capitalism. We kind of see the lie to that, in that actually people are social creatures. We need each other. We need to be interdependent. And I think in those spaces where disabled people are really supporting each other and valuing each other based on what we can contribute, not what we can't do, for me, it kind of gives a glimpse of how society could be if it was run under different principles. And I think for me, I see that more clearly through an understanding of disability than I think maybe non-disabled people sometimes do.
And there's really important lessons there, as you say, for all of us, to learn from that interdependence by necessity, but actually how that's a better way of living anyway.
How beautiful it can be, I would say. Yeah.
So I want to talk a little bit about the book. The book came out last June. Is that's right? Yeah. What inspired you to write it?
I had a lot to get off my chest. I've been fighting the Tories since 2010. I'd also after Debbie, who'd led on the UN work, so she actually passed away before the UN findings came out. In fact, a few days. It was just cry when I think about it. She was pioneering what she did there, but she developed lung cancer and died very quickly. And the validation for her work, the findings came out literally a few days before she died, and by that stage she was too confused to ever know. So I then took over the role of collating and editing all the reports that carried on going to the UN, and we were working on a UK-wide basis, so deaf and disabled people's organisations and campaigns across the whole of the UK sending information, and there was just volumes and volumes of evidence of what the government have been doing to disabled people, because people have felt so helpless. They're not listening. What can we do? So, a lot of the less political charities, for example, that's all they could do is collect the evidence to show what was happening. So report after report after report. And my job was to synthesize that. But I I had it all in my head. And I think I needed to get it out. I was also working for a disabled people's organisation at the time in I was head of campaigns and policy at Inclusion London, and that's a registered charity, so you can't be too political. So I could never actually fully articulate my analysis of why this was happening, and I felt I needed to say that. But also, to be honest, I would probably never have done anything if Zed Books hadn't just come up to me and said, it was interesting actually that one of their editors had an autistic child. And when he started school, they started to experience all these problems and these barriers. And he became a lot more aware, and then looked at the Z catalogue and there wasn't anything on disability, and thought, and they wanted an activist to write it. So they ended up asking me, and so I said yes.
And so obviously, as I've said, the book came out last summer, just as we were sort of just coming into we'd gone into lockdown in March. So, COVID and disability. So COVID, I think, has accelerated a number of trends, things like the decline of our high street and all the rest of it. And it's really highlighted many inequalities and injustices in this country. I wonder if you could talk us through that.
Yeah, I mean, I think disabled campaigners have said we thought austerity and welfare was bad, and then this came along. I mean, to an extent, through austerity and welfare reform, there's been a normalisation of disabled people's deaths through, benefit system. But this obviously is on a scale that we hadn't seen anything like before. Disability hate and hostility towards disabled people had been on the rise anyway, because the government and right-wing media rhetoric around benefits grounders and cheats, that in itself had really given permission to people to express very extreme views that disabled people shouldn't be born or be allowed to live. And then we were faced with a situation where there's this very deadly virus, which disabled people are most at risk from. Conversations, in the media and among politicians about how dispensable our lives are. This idea that the economy is more important and we can sacrifice a few thousand of those. And it turned out to be more than a few thousand. So according to the statistics from the Office for National Statistics, it was 59.5%, so 60% of all COVID-related deaths have been disabled people. And yet we haven't seen the outcry that I think disabled people would have liked against that disproportionality. It's always when there are stories, about statistics such as that, or Public Health England they published some figures on the deaths of people with learning difficulties, and that showed that younger people with learning difficulties were 30 times more likely to die of COVID than people of the same age who are non-disabled. So that's there's a big disparity there. Public Health England's reasoning for that was they're more likely to be obese or have diabetes and struggle to understand information about social distancing, which I took, I've said this a few times, I take that as them essentially saying they're fat and they're stupid. So of course they're kind of more likely to die. That was quite upsetting, because there are a huge number of political decisions and social factors which account for the higher mortality rates of disabled people, but it's not convenient to look at those. And one of the issues, we don't know how many deaths it's accounted for because there hasn't been that thorough an investigation, but the Care Quality Commission has just produced a report after it was asked to look into the issue of unlawful do not resuscitate orders being placed on the files, particularly of autistic people and people with learning difficulties. But there are a lot of disabled people with a range of different impairments who've been telephoned by their GP surgeries and kind of coerced into signing forms. The people that I know, disabled friends, tend to be the campaigners, so they've kind of, argued against this. But it's still quite a harrowing experience when you see what value society doesn't place on your life, that they're asking you, can you spare the NHS resources for someone else, please? Because you're not as important as them. Treatment rationing guidelines. Within the health system, because it's set up on a medical model, there's always been this issue of quality of life judgments that are made on people's lives. And, I've got a number of friends who died before their time because they didn't get the treatment that a non-disabled person would have done. That's kind of an everyday part of disabled people's lives. But this was on such a blanket scale with guidelines being published around using a clinical frailty score. So kind of the more disabled you are, the higher you score, so the less priority you have for treatment. And disabled people were campaigning about that from kind of March onwards. There was any number of things that people were campaigning against to try and get an equal access to healthcare and the right to live. And having to do that at the same time as shielding and being really in fear for your life has been hugely traumatic for people, I think. And obviously loss of life. Interestingly, the majority of people I know who we've lost this year, it hasn't been directly down to COVID, but I think more likely to do with the fact that people haven't had access to usual health treatments and support they would get.
Does that imply then this 60% of COVID deaths, actually that's probably masking a greater number.
Yeah, I would say so, definitely. One difficulty they had with doing the death data was the lack of information. So they had to go by the 2011 census. So, disability prevalence is rising. I can't remember what it was in 2011. It might have been only 16% of the population. It's now 21% of the population. So probably people in 2011 who weren't disabled are now, if you see what I mean. So that's an underestimate to start with. But I am very keen on seeing data around numbers of excess disabled people's deaths. I mean, if we look at disabled people tend to die prematurely, as I've said, but I was looking back at the number of activists, core DPAC activists we've lost over the last 10 years, and half have been since January 2020.
So I'm really interested to know your thoughts on, there does seem to be a huge, 21%, that's a fifth of the population, a fifth.
Yeah, we're the world's largest minority, as it happens.
And yet there isn't an outcry over this. Is it?
People see it as understandable. They've got underlying health conditions, so of course they're going to get ill. It's the working people that we need to worry about, and of course that's the neoliberal agenda, isn't it? They want the workers to do the low-paid jobs. They definitely don't want disabled people who need things like reasonable adjustments and might need support to do a job.
And so obviously with shielding coming to an end at the end of this month, this is potentially a huge problem.
I'm really worried about that, because what's going to end is the legal protection for disabled workers not to go back to the workplace, where people have got strong trade union representation. There are sort of positions that are being worked out, such as, you don't come back till you've had your second vaccine. But I know there are a lot of employers that aren't going to respect the well-being of their workers. If the government is saying it's fine for you to go out, so long as you socially distance, then you can come back to the workplace. I know that we've been told there's going to be a third wave coming and at least another 30,000 deaths. And obviously I'm very worried what percentage of that is going to be. Well, I'm worried about anyone dying, but I do feel it's particularly unfair on disabled workers. Yeah.
So look, what happens next? What can we do about this?
I think I'd always like there to be a bit more of an outcry when disabled people are really hit in these very stark ways. I think people just don't see. I think disability has been so successfully othered in the minds of the general public that people don't hear it. People often say, like with the, what's happened with austerity and welfare reform, well, why didn't we know about it? I think we've actually been quite successful, or more successful than in any period previously, in getting media attention for it. But I don't think that people necessarily take it on or listen to it because they think it doesn't apply to them unless they're disabled themselves. So I think I'd just generally like people to listen out and think a bit more about what that actually means. In terms of actively supporting us, the one big campaign that we've got at the moment actually is something that we haven't touched on yet, but that's the 20 More for All campaign, and that's about the fact that the £20 uplift to universal credit was never extended to legacy benefits, and 3/4 of the 2.2 million on legacy benefits are disabled people, and their expenditures have gone directly up as a result of the pandemic because a lot of those people have been shielding for a year. So that means, extra heating costs. It means having to buy your own PPE if you have social care workers coming in out of your house. That's quite an important thing to pay for. Online deliveries, because you can't get out to buy shopping. It's quite obvious when you look at it that you're going to have additional expenditure, but the government's kind of denied that exists. And we've been arguing that there should have been financial support for people in that situation. We collected testimonies from people, and it was just heartbreaking. People, who can't afford to bathe because, of course, hot water means energy, which you can't afford. People not able to do their laundry, not able to afford proper incontinence pads. And of course, lots of people just freezing in the winter and not able to eat. So that's the active campaign we've got at the moment. So would encourage people to really get involved in that, but also the wider campaign about keeping the £20 uplift to universal credit, because essentially people need to eat. And it's a really fundamental thing. And it's so awful that in the 6th richest country in the world, we're having to fight so hard just for people to have what they need to eat. So that's the big one on DPAC's website. But we're also going to be joining calls for there to be a full public inquiry into the government's handling of the pandemic. And we really want that to bring out some of the worst aspects of the way disabled people have been treated, such as the unlawful DNRs that have been placed on their records.
Well, look, this has been a really fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for your time. Do you have any final words for the people watching?
Just that united we can win. I think unity is the most important thing that we need at the moment. And love, because I'm Sophia Hart.
Thank you so much, Ellen. Do go to Zed Books and check out The War on Disabled People, Capitalism, Welfare and the Making of a Human Catastrophe. All the things we talked about just then, we'll put links in the description. So do go and educate yourself on the social model. Check out the links to those campaigns. Ellen, thank you very much. We'd love to have you back to talk about other stuff. That was a really interesting conversation. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
So, look, I mean, fantastic guest there. Really, really pleased we got Ellen on. Covered a lot of ground there. Some really important stuff that we talked about. Something that we perhaps should have gone into a bit more detail about, and I'm really glad you're here, Jane, to talk about this, is that switch over from DLA to PIP. I mean, so that's the disability living allowance to the personal independence payment, sold to the public as a way of saving money, but it didn't save money. In fact, it cost more money, and it had all sorts of negative impacts.
Yes, I mean, that was a really cruel switch. The disability living allowance used to be given to you as a benefit to help you as a disabled person with all the extra expenses you might have in the world. And you got it on the say-so of your doctor. And that was it. And the Tory government felt the doctors were too sympathetic to disabled people. And so they would bring in a benefit that independently assessed whether or not you were disabled, which brought in huge fear for disabled people. This constant assessment, people who have got lifelong limiting conditions, amputees, people with genetic conditions, whatever it is, they will be regularly tested. There is no exemption in PIP to being tested on a minimum of every 3 years. So absolutely cruel. But one of the other things when it was brought in, which I thought was really shocking, was that in the past, both Tory and Labour governments had encouraged people to claim the benefits that they were entitled to, because that's right, because benefits are about lifting you out of poverty. Whereas with PIP, it was the first time that I heard civil servants saying that one of the great things about this benefit was that it would actually put people off claiming, because they knew that by making people be regularly assessed, they would be put off. And so it would be deterring people from claiming the benefits that they needed to support them as disabled people. Shocking, shocking stuff. Absolutely, we must get rid of PIP. We must.
It's almost as though this government, unless they can get a rent out of you, unless they can extract profit from your work, they don't want you to exist.
Well, I think that was for me in the interview we've just seen from Ellen. That was one of the light bulb moments for me when she was talking about the ending of shielding, because we've been sold that as being a caring thing, that we care about elderly people, we care about disabled people, and that's why we've had them shielding, and that's why we've all been having lockdown, partly to help these, to shield these people who are vulnerable. But actually we're ending shielding really brutally. And the reason why we're ending it is because actually The reason why we were shielding people wasn't for their care. It was because the NHS would have been overwhelmed if we hadn't. And now we're at the point when the NHS can cope with additional severe illness and mortality. And so the government are it's like a giant back to work test. The government are basically saying, either you're fit for work at the end of this, or we don't care what happens to you. It's as brutal as that. Shocking.
Really shocking, and some really important stuff. I mean, I learned a lot. I'm going to go away and find out more about the social model, but I mean, Ellen also said some really interesting stuff about how we define disability.
I loved how she explained really simply that the reason why we don't talk about people with disabilities, but we talk about disabled people, is because it's society that disables people. And that is actually a message of pure liberation, isn't it? And it's not just liberating for disabled people, but it's a liberating way of thinking for all of us. And that's brilliant, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think it reinforces the other point about, we're sort of forced to this sort of Tory idea. Well, as I said before, I'm repeating myself now, but if they can't extract a rent from you or excess profit from your work, they don't want you to exist within this society. And this is like saying, no, this is not right. And really important stuff about the solidarity in and between disabled people.
Absolutely. I mean, again, I think one of the things that Ellen said there, we all know it was Thatcher that brought in this idea that we're all individuals. Absolute bollocks. And a really horrible, isolating message that if we've not learned anything in lockdown, we must have learned we're not individuals, we're a society, and we need other people to be, don't we? And disabled people know that because they rely on one another in order to get through. But that's real. That's what real community's about. That's what socialism's about. Again, another powerful message of transformative politics from Ellen and from our DPAC comrades.
And as we said last week, you've got to pay attention to who are they trying to push to the margins, who are they trying to vilify. Almost universally, it's people that we need to be standing alongside with and showing solidarity with.
And I mean, the fact that DPAC was set up almost as soon as the Tories got into power, because they knew then, they know now, they cannot keep waiting for, a Labour government in 4 years or in however many years. They have to fight back now. They've been fighting back since 2010, and they are still fighting back now. And we have to join with them, and we have to fight back through our unions, through solidarity, through the Labour Party, through any means that we have of protesting this callous, cruel Tory government that we have. So let's, as Ellen said so eloquently at the end, together we can win. And absolutely we can, can't we, Matt?
Absolutely. And I can't think of a better way to sum up this episode. So listen, if you've got a smaller campaign or even a huge campaign and you want it to be featured on this programme, please do get in touch. You can reach us at info@Don't Leave Organise. Support DPAC, support campaigns for disabled people in your area, fight back against this cruel, vicious Tory government. But most importantly, do not go gentle into that good night. Watch Educate, Agitate, Organise every Saturday night. Jane, thanks for joining me.
Cheers, Matt.